Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now it can be difficult to decide which graphics card to buy, especially if you're on a tighter budget. There are plenty of used options for around £150 or dollars, and honestly the card we're looking at today isn't the only choice you have if you want to be able to play every game in 2025. This is the AMD Radeon RX 6600. It has 8GB of VRAM, ray tracing support, which means it will start every game out right now, excellent power efficiency, and as of this video's upload, it is still getting updates. There was some confusion around 5 and 6000 series driver support a couple of months back, but according to AMD, these cards will still get game support for new releases, stability and game optimizations, as well as security and bug fixes just on their own driver branch. How long this will last? Well, at this point I don't know, but the latest release at the time of upload is Adrenaline 25.12.1, which released as I was making this video. Before we test some games, let me just say that if you can find the XT version of this card for similar money, or even a tiny bit more, then consider that instead for the 10 to 20% performance uplift. Other options, depending on the used market where you live, may include the superior RTX 3060 Ti, 2070 Super, or Intel Arc A770, though I'd only recommend that one if you have a CPU that supports resizable bar. As I said, prices will vary by region. There is also the older 5700 XT as well as GTX alternatives from Nvidia, but these will be limited by their lack of hardware RT support and thus won't be able to play everything. Gotta stick on theme with the title for this one. Sorry lads. So, is the 6600 a suitable new to you card or a worthwhile upgrade from your current GPU? Well, let's see what it's capable of. We'll start with Arc Raiders today. As you can see from this footage, I've nearly been wiped out already, and I decided to try and chase this big robot thing with nothing but this crowbar, which, as you can imagine, didn't turn out very well for me. What did turn out quite well though was the performance. Now I'm used to seeing this with textures that barely load, running at about 30 to 40 frames per second. We've been testing this with some really low end hardware lately, but here on the 6600 with the medium preset and FSR3 set to native AA, we're getting 90 FPS on average with respectable percentile lows. You may notice as well that I've paired the card with my i5 12400F. This is by no means a top tier system. This is a rather modern yet modest CPU in my opinion. 6 cores and 12 threads. I've also got 32 gigs of DDR4 in the system, clocked at 3200 MHz. I'm not using fast DDR5. The card itself consuming 100 watts of power max. I haven't tweaked any of the settings today, and despite this we're getting a pretty decent opening result. When it comes to Battlefield 6, well, I'm ashamed to say I abandoned some of my crew here in the armoured vehicle. I went out on my own, which did turn out to be a bit of a mistake. I ended up getting wiped out. But with the medium preset here and FSR native AA enabled once again, we are seeing at least 90 frames per second. Now I don't have the HD textures installed here. I don't think that's really necessary, especially with an 8GB GPU. As you can see, we're coming pretty close to the VRAM limitation of the card anyway, but performance is holding up really nicely and the game looks good. I hopped back into this vehicle here and wiped out a few enemy players, no problem. It's important that things remain pretty consistent when playing online. In my opinion, you don't want to be chasing after someone and then all of a sudden your frame rate just dips out of nowhere. And with this i5 and 6600 combo, things are holding up fairly well. It's running really nicely in my opinion. When it comes to Counter-Strike 2, each map will vary slightly, as will each game mode. The same can be said for Battlefield 6, or any game really. My benchmark here just consisted of playing an online deathmatch in this specific map. With the high preset here and MSAA turned off, we were seeing 182 frames per second with a 1% low of 97 and a 0.1% low of 71, so very consistent overall. Not really sure what the GPU and CPU utilization is doing. I'm not sure if this is more CPU intensive, but utilization just seems to be all over the place here. This combo is performing pretty well though, and you'll have no issues in achieving over 60 FPS at 1080p or beyond most probably. Now, as I said at the start, the RX 6600 does support ray tracing, but I wouldn't really recommend enabling it. I think it's going to take too much of a toll on the performance of this card, and things are far more enjoyable when we leave it off. It's just nice to have it because it does mean that some of the games out there that won't otherwise run, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle for example, as well as the new Doom, they will fire up just fine, even if we have to be a little more realistic with our expectations in terms of settings. The reason I bring up ray tracing, of course, is because of Cyberpunk 2077 here. I did, of course, leave it off, but with the high preset at 1080p and medium crowds, which it defaulted to, with this preset, we were getting over 60 FPS, 70 was indeed the average. Now, because I'm using the i5, not a top tier processor, there will be a few more dips and drops in busier areas, hence the percentile lows, but I think this is the sort of CPU that you'd be looking at pairing the 6600 with, this or maybe a Ryzen 5 5600X. If you want a chip on a newer platform and you're lucky enough to have DDR5 RAM, then maybe a 7500F. This pairing though, well, it makes for a fine 1080p setup. When it comes to Fortnite, I think you may want to turn things down a little more. This is another online competitive shooter, so I think you're probably going to want to stick with lower settings in order to maximise frame rates. That said, you can utilise Nanite and Lumen if you wish with a 6600, as I have done so here. We also have the high resolution textures installed. This is a setting that's easy to miss, but when you're initially installing the game from the Epic Store, you can decide whether or not to enable higher resolution textures. Not sure how much of a performance difference this actually makes, but all I know is that with the 6600 and these textures installed, we were still getting at least 60 FPS pretty much most of the time. As I said before though, probably worth sticking with medium settings for a nice balance between visual quality and performance fidelity, but if you want to enable the fancy Nanite and Lumen options, you can do so and still get relatively smooth and consistent frame rates from this card. Now, I know what I said about ray tracing and leaving it off, but GTA 5 Enhanced is up next, and this one actually runs with at least 60 FPS with the high RT preset and Ray Trace Global Illumination enabled and set to high. Now, Ray Trace Global Illumination, or RTGI, is the option that makes the biggest difference visually when it comes to this new version of GTA 5, and I definitely recommend enabling it if your card can handle it. I was curious to see whether or not that was the case with the 6600, and it does appear to be the case. I mean, we're also using FSR3 native here. We can choose TAA, but that does look a little blurry even when the sharpness is turned right up, and because we have that decent plus 60 FPS average to start with, we have a little bit of headroom to spare, so FSR3 will certainly knock our frames down a bit. It will take a little bit of performance away from us, but we can enable it and still get a plus 60 FPS experience pretty much all of the time here, so no complaints from me with the 6600 in GTA Enhanced. I have added Helldivers 2 back into the benchmarks because a lot of you were requesting that I did so. Here with the high preset and high textures, we're looking at 68 frames per second overall. This one actually runs really consistently, and that is the case with a lot of my tested hardware. I rarely have issues with frame times and dips and drops in this one. It always runs pretty much flawlessly, and that is no exception with the 6600, 68 frames per second. The percentile lows, the 1.1% lows, were pretty much the same, 64 and 63, so you can see what I mean by consistency here, and with the high preset the game looks good. Now when you choose the high preset, I don't think the textures automatically switch to high as well, but I set these manually, and we've still got a pretty good amount of VRAM headroom left over when it comes to the utilization, as you can see from the statistics on the left of your screen. I do think we could potentially push this to 1440p in some cases, but this is very much a 1080p card in my opinion. I'd rather get closer to 1080p 60 FPS than set things to 1440p and then have to enable some pretty aggressive upscaling in order to try and hit that frame rate target. But it's entirely up to you, of course. The beauty of PC gaming is that you can do as you wish with your own hardware. Next up we have Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Now I mentioned this one earlier as one of the games that requires ray tracing to start. Now if you don't want to play any games that require a ray tracing capable GPU, then you can of course opt for a lower end graphics card and still have a great time. But I like the 6600 because it doesn't cost too much and you don't have to worry about whether or not it will start all of the latest titles out there. That's why I think it's a decent option for the money in 2025. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle then, I started off with the high settings. The game did open, which I was surprised by. Sometimes with 8GB cards it doesn't, but it was performing at like 27 FPS. The same can be said for medium. We were basically limited to low here. I am using native resolution, so no upscaling. I'm using TAA. The higher res textures were obviously not installed here. Now you may be looking at this frame rate and thinking surely we could push things to medium, and I did go back and try that again after I saw this performance, 86 FPS. I thought we've got a little bit of headroom, but no, the card is just like, nah, you're gonna be limited to low, I'm afraid. And as you can see by the VRAM utilization on the left of the screen, we're pretty much maxing it out as it is. This doesn't seem too problematic. There weren't any massive dips or drops, but definitely worth sticking with low in the case of the 8GB 6600. One of my favourites of 2025, next, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 with the medium preset. Again, I tried high, but there were too many dips and drops in terms of performance for my liking. I think high with some FSR enabled would have been fine, but I like to try and stick to native res where I can. Here with medium we were seeing 83 FPS with pretty decent percentile lows, 75 and 72, so it was a very consistent experience, and I think medium settings is where you're going to find yourself in a lot of titles moving forward. Medium or high 1080p, sometimes like in Indiana Jones you may be limited to low, and in other cases you may feel as though enabling FSR is the best bet. You could also push settings a bit higher in some of the games we have tested and enable upscaling if you want to, but as I said before, it's entirely up to you. Kingdom Come 2 here though, well, it's running really nicely at medium. We're seeing at least 60 FPS pretty much most of the time, and I'm really happy with how the 6600 is doing today. Now I was expecting worse performance from Oblivion Remastered, I have to admit. At 1080p with a medium preset we were seeing 65 FPS, but I did enable FSR3 quality. The reason for that is because whether or not we chose medium or low with native resolution, we were getting about 47 FPS. It didn't make a difference which preset I went with, to be honest. Between medium or low it just would not budge past 50 FPS. I found that enabling FSR3, setting it to quality, didn't really sacrifice anything in terms of visual clarity, but it did give us a nice performance bump. I've also gone with the high reflections on top of the medium preset because it makes the water actually look like water, otherwise it can just look like it's been painted. Do you know how the water in Crysis used to look back in the day if you turn the settings down to low? That's sort of how it looks in Oblivion unless you choose the high option. And we can afford to do that here. 65 FPS with the usual dips and drops that you're going to see from this one. But I'd certainly recommend enabling FSR if you want the best experience with a card like this. Now, I wasn't expecting any issues in Red Dead Redemption 2, and I didn't really get any issues either. That said, when I first fired this up, we were seeing dips and drops here and there. I realised this is because I had turned async compute off in the INI file, or maybe it defaulted to off, I don't know, but I went into the game's INI file, the system file, enabled async compute, and this actually leveled out that frame time graph. It smoothed things out nicely. We're using the ultra settings here. Everything else is set to high. The geometry LOD is set to max. The grass LOD or level of detail is set to 2 out of 10. And we're also using TAA medium for 75 FPS. There will be the occasional dip and drop below 60, but for the most part, yeah, we can really push the settings up quite a lot here and have a great looking game as well as a great experience performance wise. We will finalise with Where Winds Meet, possibly one of the more demanding games that I've tested today, aside from Oblivion of course. Here I'm using the balanced preset at 1080p, we're still using native resolution of course, for 72 frames per second overall. As you can see by the 1.1% lows of 53 and 11, there was the occasional dip and drop. I think this 0.1% low was actually because of a minor frame spike as I was sort of moving between areas, but aside from that I didn't notice any significant issues when running this one on the 6600, so for the most part, yeah, it was pretty good, and the balance preset is a nice place to be for this one. It looks good and it runs nicely as well. But there we are. Overall, the AMD Radeon RX 6600, in my opinion, is still a solid, lower cost option in 2025. If you have less than £200 or dollars to spend, maybe closer to £150 here in the UK, and you want a card that you know is going to start and run everything out there right now, you're interested in playing at 1080p, then I don't think this is a bad choice at all. As I've mentioned a couple of times now though, look out for the XT version, same amount of VRAM, but you will get a performance boost from it, and in some cases it really doesn't cost much more at all. Also keep an eye out for alternatives, the 3060 Ti. Markets are going to be different depending on where you live, of course, but if we look at the RX 6600 on its own and appreciate it for what it is, then I think it's still doing a pretty respectable job. As always though, let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you as always for watching, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.